The historic chamber did not erupt into chaotic shouts or dramatic whispers when the decision was read aloud. Instead, it completely froze into a heavy, suffocating silence. It was a single, definitive constitutional ruling delivered with absolute ceremonial calm and traditional precision, yet it cut sharply through years of unwritten palace assumptions and landed directly at the very heart of the British monarchy's future survival. For months, Queen Camilla had quietly expected to maintain a steady stream of influence over the family's domestic arrangements, perhaps even assuming she would hold a quiet, unchallenged seat near the final decision-making table regarding where the younger generation would be groomed. Instead, the Privy Council, acting as a historic body of senior advisors that formally supports the sovereign on critical matters of state, declared an unbreakable line that she absolutely could not cross under any circumstances. Prince George's future home, his private sanctuary, and his developmental environment were officially declared completely beyond her authority, totally beyond her reach, and entirely beyond negotiation. As the final words of the decree settled over the room like an unyielding sentence that could not be softened by wealth or status, Camilla did not move an inch, nor did she speak a word to defend her position. Her fingers tightened visibly around the ornate arm of her chair, her knuckles turning pale as the reality of the legal document washed over her. King Charles sat near her, his crown heavy with the burdens of state, but the monarch kept his gaze strictly lowered toward the mahogany table, refusing to look in her direction, as if one single glance might turn a cold constitutional ruling into a deeply painful personal betrayal. Across the chamber stood Prince William, his stance tall, his face completely still, and his emotions tightly controlled under the watchful eyes of the courtiers. The Prince of Wales had won the battle, securing the exact boundary he wanted protected for his eldest son, but he knew this victory over George's future residence could still leave deep, lasting wounds within the fragile family structure around him. This definitive ruling by the Privy Council meant that where George would live, where he would be privately prepared for his ultimate destiny, and how his early path toward kingship would be guarded could no longer be shaped by Camilla's personal wishes, her household staff, or her unique daily access to King Charles. The legal architecture of the palace had redefined George's home not as a mere family preference or a domestic choice to be argued over tea, but strictly as succession planning. And succession planning meant the absolute future of the crown itself. William understood perfectly why that mattered, but his wife, Catherine, understood it even more deeply in her soul. For them, George was never just a historic boy who would one day inherit the throne of an empire. He was first and foremost their son, a vulnerable child whose precious childhood could not be treated like a strategic palace asset or a pawn in an ongoing game of royal proximity. The young prince had already seen enough invisible pressure gather around his household to know how quickly adult affection could be turned into political leverage behind closed doors. Catherine had watched George grow up under a mountain of silent expectations, and she feared any outside influence that might turn his private home into a public symbol before his mind was ready to bear the weight. The room grew even colder when a senior clerk stepped forward to read from a documented account attached to the council's official file. The document revealed that previous attempts had quietly been made through household recommendations to subtly influence George's future living arrangements and daily schedule. The bureaucratic phrasing sounded completely harmless on the surface, almost polite and helpful, but in that silent room, every single person understood the dangerous undercurrent. Someone had tried to move power quietly through daily proximity instead of asking for formal permission, tried to establish a precedent before anyone could object. When the words "no delegated authority" were spoken aloud into the cold air, Camilla finally looked down, her composure fracturing just for a second. King Charles exhaled a long, tired breath but said absolutely nothing to defend his queen, while William refused to let even a hint of a smile show on his face. As the ink dried on the historic ruling, every eye in the room turned toward the royal family, knowing that their private loyalties were about to be tested in a very public silence. At the absolute center of this palace storm was a young prince who never asked to become a constitutional battlefield. George's future home was not merely a luxurious residence with historic walls. It was the ultimate symbol of royal training, protection, inheritance, and institutional control. Around his young life stood William, Catherine, Charles, and Camilla, each carrying a different fear, a personal wound, and a completely conflicting vision of what the British monarchy must become after this ruling. William understood the immediate danger before anyone else said it aloud. To the protective prince, George's future home was not a palace prize to be won, not a grand ceremonial address to boast about, and certainly not a line to be shifted on some private royal map by ambitious relatives. It was the one single place left on earth where his son could still breathe normally, run around, and just be a child before the heavy weight of the crown began closing around his life forever. William had lived long enough inside the cold, unforgiving machinery of the monarchy to know exactly how easily a royal childhood could be completely swallowed by duty, leaving nothing but emotional scars. He knew George would one day belong entirely to history, but he was fiercely determined that his boy would not be handed over to machine a single day too soon. Catherine felt that profound truth in a much quieter, deeper way as a mother. The storm arrived. She did not view the future home as a grand royal training ground or a corporate headquarters for the next heir. She saw it strictly as a shield against a predatory world. George desperately needed rooms where he could laugh without being measured by hidden courtiers, make normal mistakes without those mistakes becoming a global headline, and grow up naturally without hearing every adult whisper about the throne waiting for him in the distant future. For Catherine, the Privy Council's ruling mattered immensely because it protected something far more valuable than mere royal authority. It protected her son's innocence. It guaranteed him a private corner of life before public expectation began demanding everything he had to give. King Charles, however, felt the sharp wound open from both sides of his heart. The king picked up the heavy council file with trembling hands, read the cold wording of the ruling once more, and set it down without uttering a single word to the room. He knew deeply that William's fierce determination was not an act of rebellion against the throne. It was pure fatherhood sharpened by the fear of repeating past mistakes. But Charles also knew that Camilla had been publicly diminished and stripped of her pride by this decree, and his own silence beside her would feel like a total abandonment of his wife. The ancient rules of the monarchy had placed him in the cruelest position possible for a father and a husband. To support the future king and ensure the stability of the succession, he had to silently accept the public humiliation of his queen consort. Yet to defend her wishes, he would have to challenge the constitutional boundaries protecting his own grandson. Camilla carried her sudden injury differently than the rest. She did not rage or cause a scene in front of the council. She simply absorbed the blow into her rigid posture. The true pain for her was not just that she had been denied influence over one specific royal house. The deeper, more devastating blow was that the ruling had clearly defined the permanent edge of her future role within the royal family. It proved that she could stand beside Charles at grand events, attend state ceremonies, and wear the dignity of her royal title. But when the monarchy looked toward its future in Prince George, her hand would never be allowed on the door. Then, a private aide confirmed what made the room tighten even further. George's residence plan had already been fully drafted and locked away before Camilla was even informed that she had no say in the matter. Catherine noticed William's absolute stillness across the room and understood it at once. His calm demeanor was not a sign of inner peace. It was a deeply controlled anger shaped into a solemn duty to protect his bloodline. The emotional lines of the palace were now permanently drawn in stone, but the true cause of this massive constitutional crisis lay deeply buried in a hidden, uncomfortable moment that everyone had tried desperately to forget before. Every single palace crisis in modern royal memory has a specific hidden starting point, a brief and quiet moment that people later pretend was much smaller and more insignificant than it actually was. This explosive confrontation did not begin within the grand walls of courtroom or during a formal council chamber meeting, but rather at a small, private family dinner at Windsor Castle, where a single, unexpected sentence changed the entire emotional temperature of the room in an instant. Queen Camilla had spoken fluidly during the main course, as though Prince George's future residence, schooling, and daily environment were simple domestic topics that could easily be adjusted, tweaked, and managed by a casual family agreement over the dining table. Prince William, however, heard something entirely different beneath her polite tone. He recognized an immediate, calculated attempt to step into his eldest son's carefully guarded future and establish a foothold of influence. William felt a sudden, cold shift in the room before Camilla's sentence had even fully landed or been processed by the other guests. The protective prince had come to that private dinner expecting nothing more than the usual careful royal smiles, highly restrained conversations, and the familiar, exhausting palace habit of speaking around deep family pain rather than through it. But when Camilla casually suggested that George had spent a significant part of his upcoming preparation years in a specific household layout much closer to the king's daily physical guidance and personal oversight, the silence that followed was not polite or typical. It was highly dangerous and heavy. The queen consort had masterfully framed her suggestion as an act of pure tradition, presenting it as if keeping the young boy in close physical proximity to King Charles would naturally strengthen institutional continuity and smooth the path for the crown's ultimate survival. William, however, did not see tradition. He heard a quiet method control expertly wrapped in historic ceremony. Catherine went completely still beside her husband, her eyes narrowing as she instantly understood the profound meaning hidden beneath the soft, helpful layers of Camilla's words. The suggestion cut the princess even deeper because young George was not present at the table to defend his own childhood or protect his right to a normal life away from the heavy machinery of the state. To Catherine, the future home being discussed so casually between courses was not just a geographic location where her son might sleep, study, or have tea. It was the ultimate sanctuary, the one place on earth where he would feel safe enough to remain a normal human being before the crown began permanently shaping his mind into something far larger and less free. When the Princess of Wales looked toward William, she saw his jaw tighten instantly, not with a look of sudden surprise, but with a dark, grim look of recognition. He had been waiting for this line to appear in sand for a very long time, and now it had finally shown itself in the open. King Charles immediately tried to soften the rising tension in the room, speaking with a heavy voice about historic duty, royal guidance, and the massive spiritual weight of preparing a young heir for the immense burdens that lay ahead in a changing world. Yet, the more the king tried to smooth over the rough edges of the conversation and placate both sides, the more William felt deeply abandoned by his own father. Charles did not openly reject Camilla's sudden suggestion, nor did he draw a clear, protective constitutional boundary right there at the table. Instead, he hovered uncomfortably in the middle, torn between his duty as a husband and his love as a father. That painful hesitation struck William harder and deeper than any open, shouting argument ever could have done in public. In that agonizing pause, the Prince of Wales understood with absolute clarity that if he did not stand up and protect George's future home with his entire strength, no one else in the palace would ever do it with the same fierce protective force. Camilla later tried to treat the entire dinner exchange as a simple, harmless misunderstanding, but the cold machinery of the palace had already begun to move behind the scenes. A senior palace secretary, sensing the historic weight of the confrontation, wrote a highly detailed, private internal memo summarizing the exact wording of the exchange, and that sensitive document eventually found its way into the official Privy Council file as evidence. The most damaging line in the entire report was simple, direct, and completely devastating to Camilla's position. It stated that informal influence was actively being presented as ordinary family counsel. In plain, unvarnished words, it meant that private, behind-the-scenes palace pressure was being artificially dressed up as loving, grandfatherly advice. That single sentence changed everything for the royal household. It turned Catherine's quiet, internal hurt into hard legal evidence. It turned William's deep anger into a solid constitutional case. And it turned Camilla's casual suggestion into the exact spark behind the historic ruling that would later strip her of any say over George's future residence. That Windsor dinner transformed a private family discomfort into a formal legal battle, and their very next encounter would no longer be disguised by polite smiles or royal etiquette. Once the dark memory of that dinner reached the official council papers, there was absolutely no way for William and Camilla to avoid facing each other directly. The ultimate confrontation did not happen before the eyes of the Privy Council, nor did it take place with the shield of royal protocol. It happened immediately after the meeting, in a narrow, dimly lit palace corridor with no cameras, no ceremony, and no official advisors to break the tension. William and Camilla came face to face with the fresh ruling still vibrating between them like an open wound. King Charles stood several steps away from them, appearing completely frozen and paralyzed by the impossible, heartbreaking choice he was forced to make between his queen and his son. Catherine watched the interaction from the far end of the hallway, her heart pounding, because she knew this battle was no longer just about a piece of royal real estate. It was fundamentally about trust and the survival of her son's happiness. William did not raise his voice a single octave, and that absolute, icy restraint made the moment significantly worse for everyone present. The prince stood with the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who had already fought and won the battle in his mind before the first word was ever spoken aloud in the corridor. The Privy Council ruling had officially and permanently removed Camilla from any formal or informal role in deciding Prince George's future home, and every single person standing in that narrow space understood the massive weight of what that meant. George's residence was no longer a flexible topic open for private family influence, subtle persuasion, or quiet palace pressure behind closed doors. It belonged exclusively to the long, unyielding path of succession, and William had officially become its principal, legally backed protector. Camilla tried desperately to hold her ground and save her pride, telling William with a sharp voice that she had never intended to interfere in his household, and that her only true concern had always been for the ultimate stability, continuity, and institutional strength of the crown. But the prince answered her with a sentence so quiet, so cold, and so deliberate that it cut much deeper than any loud display of anger ever could. He looked her directly in the eyes and said that George's life was absolutely not a matter for negotiation. Those words landed with immense force because they instantly stripped away every soft, polite explanation the queen consort could ever manufacture. Camilla could call it historic concern. She could call it deep royal tradition, but William had now officially named it a boundary. King Charles shifted his weight forward, and for one painful, agonizing second, it seemed as though the king might finally speak up and intervene. He looked toward Camilla's stressed face, then turned toward William's unyielding stance, but his own deep hesitation betrayed him completely. He could not defend his wife without appearing to weaken his son's rightful authority as a father, and he could not support the prince without leaving his queen consort completely exposed to public humiliation. That single, heavy pause said far more than any official palace statement ever could. The monarchy had trapped him between love and legacy, and he had no clean way out of the storm. Palace staff felt the immediate shift in power before the sun had even set. Access lists began to change, invitations to private meetings began to tighten significantly, and all future residence discussions were moved exclusively through highly controlled, formal channels. The old, comfortable habits of the royal households, where immense power and influence often traveled through casual conversation, physical closeness, and perfect timing, had been stopped instantly by a single piece of paper. Camilla understood it, Catherine understood it, and William understood it most of all. Then, the prince produced a Windsor dinner memo from his jacket. He did not wave it around like a weapon, but simply held it quietly between them, asking Camilla if she recognized the exact wording that had triggered the constitutional review. The phrase was still there, cold and damaging on the white paper. Informal influence presented as family counsel. The queen consort looked at the page for a brief second, then looked away into the shadows of the corridor, unable to deny or explain the text. Her heavy silence became far more powerful and telling than any formal confession could ever be. Catherine watched that silence harden into absolute truth. Charles lowered his tired eyes toward the floor, and William slowly folded the memo back into his pocket and stepped away. The damage had already been fully done, and as a heavy oak door closed between them, the ancient, hidden machinery of the crown began to reveal who truly held the keys to Prince George's destiny. Power within the ancient structure of the British monarchy rarely announces its presence with dramatic raised voices or chaotic public arguments. Instead, it moves quietly through formal signatures, official wax seals, historic precedents, and hidden rooms where even intense family emotion is forced to wait outside the door. The definitive Privy Council ruling did not simply cause a temporary embarrassment for Queen Camilla behind closed doors. It completely exposed a rigid, unyielding foundational structure that exists beneath the glittering gold of the crown. Prince George's future home was never treated by the state as a flexible domestic preference or a simple family matter. It was treated strictly as succession architecture, heavily guarded by constitutional experts who understood exactly what one single wrong outside influence could become over a lifetime. King Charles read through the detailed legal reasoning of the document with the immense weight of man seeing his own family's deep internal pain turned into cold, permanent official language. The king's eyes moved across each typed line slowly and deliberately, as if reducing his reading speed might somehow make the finality of the words less permanent and binding, but absolutely nothing in the text softened the blow. The entire ruling rested immovably on one core constitutional principle. George's future residences had to serve as direct, unfiltered preparation for future kingship under strict parental and constitutional guardianship alone. In plain legal terms, constitutional guardianship meant the formal, unassailable protection of a future monarch's developmental path, ensuring all major life decisions remain tied strictly to duty, codified law, and a direct line of succession rather than bending to personal domestic pressure or internal household rivalries. Inside the quiet council room, an elderly clerk watched King Charles from the far end of the long table, noticing a sharp emotional shift before anyone else in the room did. The king's face lost its remaining color when the document explicitly explained that Camilla's high position as queen consort did not grant her any automatic legal authority or customary oversight over the direct heir's own heir. She could stand proudly beside the monarch during public events. She could share his visible public life, and she could wear the historical dignity of her role, but she could never step into the systemic decisions that shaped George's future as the next generation of the crown. That specific sentence did not sound intentionally cruel. It sounded entirely final, and that absolute finality was exactly what made the wound hurt so deeply. William stood apart from the main table, silent, but certainly not untouched by the gravity of the moment. The protective prince was not celebrating or showing signs of triumph, because there was nothing joyful about seeing a painful family rupture written permanently into royal procedure. Yet, a profound sense of relief moved through him all the same as the final documents were stamped. George's childhood boundaries had been successfully protected. Catherine's deepest motherly fears had been officially heard by the state, and the quiet, manipulative pressure that had followed the Windsor dinner had been formally named and stopped. For William, that was the only thing that truly mattered, because a vulnerable child's private home could never be allowed to become the toxic place where adult ambition tests its reach. Then, a highly marked passage appeared in the final pages, stating that household proximity must never be mistaken for constitutional standing. Those specific words were completely devastating because they explained the entire hidden conflict in one single, definitive blow. Being physically close to King Charles did not mean holding legal power over Prince George. Sitting near the physical throne did not mean shaping parameters of the next reign. Camilla's personal influence had reached its absolute legal limit, and that limit had been drawn in a highly codified language that no ambitious courtier could ever bend or misinterpret. A secondary document made the council's ruling even sharper and more restrictive, confirming that George's future home had already been legally categorized as a protected succession residence. This meant the property belonged entirely to the long, institutional preparation of a future king, and was completely removed from ordinary family arrangements or domestic adjustments. Once the strict category became known within the palace walls, Camilla's exclusion was no longer just a symbolic gesture. It began changing the daily operations of the palace immediately. The ruling had been written in highly formal, bureaucratic language, but its real-world consequences arrived within the royal household like a loud bell that no one could unhear. By the very next morning, the environment of the palace had changed completely, not loudly or official in a way the public could yet understand, but through a series of quiet, undeniable shifts. Doors that had once opened through daily habit now required formal, written permission from William's household. Daily schedules were drastically revised, and key security staff were reassigned. Camilla discovered the true weight of the ruling not as a cold line in a legal document, but as a series of polite, quiet refusals from palace aides. For the very first time since her marriage into the family, the future of the monarchy around Prince George moved forward without her shadow falling across it. When Camilla arrived at the scheduling office expecting the usual rhythm of access, a senior aide met her before she could even enter the room, speaking with the absolute softness palace staff use when the answer is already final. Her name was no longer on the official access list for the Residence Planning Committee. The Queen Consort smiled once, a carefully practiced, strained smile, and turned away before the true extent of her humiliation could show too clearly to the staff. This specific restriction mattered immensely because these meetings were no longer ordinary family discussions. George's future residences had been placed under direct succession control, meaning only Catherine, William, Charles in a strictly limited role, and designated succession advisors could be included in the room. Succession advisors were the trusted, lifelong constitutional officials whose sole job was to protect the planned path of a future monarch, making sure private household wishes did not interfere with the crown's long-term stability. This single chain transformed every conversation around George. His home was now officially protected territory. Staff received new, explicit instructions before lunch, stating that residence planning could no longer be discussed through informal family channels. There would be no more quiet remarks made over dinner, no soft suggestions passed through personal secretaries, and no household influence disguised as grandmotherly concern. The palace had always survived on subtle whispers as much as hard rules. But now, the whispers had been cut off at the root. William's relief was real, yet it carried a heavy emotional cost. Every closed door that successfully protected his son also widened the painful wound around Charles and Camilla. King Charles found her later that afternoon, seated completely alone in a private sitting room with her composure still intact, but her pride visibly bruised. The king understood then that the Privy Council ruling had moved far beyond mere legal procedure. It had become a permanent personal humiliation for his wife. Camilla had not simply been excluded from a routine meeting. She had been shown exactly where her authority ended in the eyes of the British state. He wanted to comfort her, but he also knew the decision fundamentally protected George's well-being, and that conflicting truth left him with no easy words. Then, the revised schedule made the new reality impossible to deny. Camilla had been officially removed from the private viewing of the proposed architectural plans for the residence. Catherine heard the update later that evening and asked her staff only one question. Had George been told anything about the conflict? Her concern cut right to the complex palace politics. She was thinking entirely of her son's innocent heart, not the palace's fractured pride. The fallout from the battle had bruised everyone involved, but the ultimate turning point could only come when William and King Charles finally faced the wound directly, with the household shifting around them. Father and son were forced into the private conversation they had both avoided for far too long. For all the grand ceremonies surrounding kings and heirs, the true turning point of the crisis came in a small room with absolutely no witnesses or staff. William entered the room first, and Charles followed slowly, carrying the immense exhaustion of a reigning monarch and the deep regret of a father. There were no aides present, no legal files on the table, no Camilla, no Catherine, and no council voices between them. There were only two men facing the true cost of protecting Prince George from a bitter family conflict he was far too young to understand. William did not begin the conversation with loud accusations, as that would have been far easier to handle. Instead, the prince spoke with the absolute control of someone who had already spent too many sleepless nights holding back his anger for the sake of royal duty. He told Charles directly that George's home could never become a political compromise between adult loyalties. It could never be softened just to spare Camilla's pride, and it could never be adjusted so the palace could pretend everyone still stood in perfect unity. His son needed a place shaped entirely by safety, not palace rivalry, and the future king refused to let that truth be buried beneath polite royal language. Charles listened without interrupting once, needing William to understand the other deep pain in the room. The pain of watching Camilla publicly limited while he still wore the crown. She had been beside him through years of intense public judgment, through hard silences, and through the slow, painful climb toward public acceptance. Now, the ruling had reminded everyone that her place beside him did not mean power over the future of the crown. Charles felt that wound deeply as a husband, but he also knew it did not erase George's need for absolute protection. William pressed further, his voice carrying something softer than anger as he revealed a private conversation he had shared with Catherine after the Windsor dinner. He explained that Catherine had feared George would one day feel like a prize being moved between factions, a boy treated as the property of competing visions rather than the child at the center of them all. In that moment, Catherine had not spoken like a future queen. She had spoken entirely like a mother afraid that duty might steal her son's childhood too soon. King Charles finally broke, admitting quietly that he should have stopped the Windsor dinner conversation before it became an open wound, and that his hesitation had taught William that silence could feel like a betrayal. Charles then removed his glasses and placed them beside the file, telling William he would not challenge the ruling. In that single sentence, the king accepted the boundary and the pain, choosing the child over the conflict, a choice that permanently secured Prince George's safety and his right to be guided by love before duty claimed his life forever.